Welcome, Internet, to psychoanalytic talk. And today we're going to be talking about an unofficial concept, at least one that hasn't been necessarily theorized a lot, but I think is very useful. That of the canned interpretation, as presented by Ogden in Reverie and Interpretation, Sensing Something Human. So, how he defines it, on the whole, if we had to generalize, is the idea that it is an interpretation that is offered by the clinician to the patient, but it doesn't quite ring true when a clinician does it. So it's not a lie in the fact that the clinician is not making something up, but it doesn't seem to quite hit the mark when it comes to what the patient is experiencing and what the clinician is experiencing within the countertransference. So it's a form of disjunction between what is truly happening within the clinician and what is happening within the patient, as if it was a kind of misleadingness. And I found that concept to be very, very interesting. So, how come? Well, fundamentally, there is this idea when you make an interpretation, because there's always two paths to the interpretation. There's the intellectual path, i.e., you understand what the patient is going through because you've read about that problem, you kind of got the general idea of the problem. And the problem can be very vast, right? It can be anything from attachment issues, from the Oedipus complex, through anxiety, and so on and so forth. So it's not like one fundamental issue, right? It can be a myriad of sins, and in that myriad of sins, you as a clinician have learned a lot about the mental development. So there is that path of intellectualization that you can give to the patient, but it might feel like you are sticking something onto the patient that might not be there. So there's that risk always with intellectualness of putting something on the patient that's not really there, but you feel should be there because you've learned about the said issue and that you kind of projecting your intellectual construct onto the patient. So there's always that risk with the canon interpretation that it doesn't feel right. But beyond that, because that's like one version of it, but beyond that, there's the fact of you feeling something and it's not quite right. Like it should be right, and yet it isn't. It is, if we were to go with Ogden's vocabulary, it's kind of dead. And that's where it becomes interesting, because when you do those interpretations, no one is forcing you to do them. It's not as if the patient had requested an interpretation in the here and now, but you do it. As a clinician, you give the interpretation. And it becomes very interesting of why do you feel that you have to give an interpretation? So this in and of itself is a fundamental proposition that sometimes we give interpretations that are not quite right, and we still give them, not because we're forced to, but because something in us triggers and we feel that we have to answer to something. And this in of itself can help us mentally, because once you've understood that what you have said is not quite right, doesn't quite fit, well, then something opens up, both in the clinician and in the patient. I'm going to start with the patient. The patient can correct you. That's one of the most beautiful things of psychotherapy. You can say, well, not quite, no. And in that moment, the patient is going to start to deconstruct what you've said and start saying, no, well, there might be something like that, but I feel that it's more like this. And they're going to point you into a new direction. That new direction is so fundamental, and that's the crux of psychodynamic therapy, is that moment where you had a blind spot and the patient is going to help you to understand better the situation. So that's very important in that sense, but there's also, it is useful for the therapist, because as you do the canned interpretation, you realize that something is off within your countertransference, that somehow you are obliging yourself to do that. And you start to rethink the whole case scenario of why did you feel that you had to go that way? How come? And that's both paths are so very interesting. Both the reframing of the patient and the rethinking of the clinician can happen both at the same time, or they can be one, or they can be the other. Because in certain cases, certain patients might want to reframe it, but might not feel comfortable questioning the point of view of the clinician, or sometimes the clinician himself might not feel comfortable in deconstructing what he's said. But the whole process opens up something new. Of course, for it to be a canned interpretation, The therapist has to be open to the idea that what he's saying might not always be true, not always be real, so to speak, in the relationship, that the mistakes are always there, and he has to remain, or she has to remain, very open to the possibility of making mistakes within the interpretations. And that's what I find very fundamental in this idea of canned interpretation, because it resitué, as we would say in French. So in English it would be we put in forward the idea that an interpretation is what it is. It's something that's not a reality, it's a construct that is made in order to put meaning into the situation. But that meaning is not always linear, and it's not always intellectual. Sometimes it can be very emotional. That emotionality is not necessarily something that's going to be quite included in an intellectual construct. And what's so amazing about this idea of canned interpretation is that it's something that should be a defect within the relationship, yet it becomes a fundamental asset, I think. Of course, that's not to say that you should say everything and anything to the patient, but when the canned interpretation happens and that you're open enough to be able to think about it, and the patient is at ease enough to be able to say, wait, I don't agree with that, or yeah, there's something to what you've just said, but it's not exactly it. It allows the therapy to grow, the relationship to grow, and for both parties to truly understand something that would not have been necessarily possible without the canned interpretation. There's also the other aspect that the canned interpretation, I think, is a fundamental net positive, even though it might seem very strange. But it's a fundamental net positive because it shows, A, that the patient has his own agency, and that the therapist is not always right, and that allows for the patient to regain a form of autonomy from the clinician and be able to question it. It also creates a fundamental realness in the relationship. Like, it's not the therapist as this almighty professional that knows everything, that thinks of everything, that can't be wrong. It's about two people, two humans trying to work together in order for the patient to heal from the issue at hand. And that is so fundamental because in canned interpretations, at least what I understand from it, is that it's a second chance. That it's not quite right, but because of our simultaneous work, patient and therapist, you get a second chance at the interpretation. And one of the things that one can also act upon is, as a clinician, you can also say, wait a minute, I might have gotten this wrong, or I might not have formulated it right. So the canned interpretation is always so essential when you can make something of it. Because one of the big dangers, I think, with canned interpretations is if the therapist or the patient do not allow themselves to question, to go beyond what is said. There's a real danger of the situation becoming sterile, or, again, to use Ogden the word dead, that the therapy itself becomes dead because nothing can be questioned. And the fact also of creating a space in which the therapist might be wrong creates a lack that allows the patient to think for himself or for herself, and to, in some ways, in a very short span, invert the whole process of like, no. The patient is like, I can now guide you through this process. And I think that's, if it's not all the time, of course, if it's not systematic, it's very healthy, as the patient, in a way, becomes their therapist and helps the therapist to help them, in a way, as if they, at that very moment, became a colleague with what can be made of the canned interpretation. Of course, there is always a fundamental danger if the therapist is dead set on being right, or on his intellectual construct, that he feels that there is no place for canned interpretations, that the interpretation, if he makes it, is right. And that, I think, creates a moment of complete oppression of the therapist onto the patient, a moment where he's going to superpose everything onto the patient rather than trying to co-construct, co-build into something greater. And that's the whole point, I think, of canned interpretations. When you realize it can be an incredible door open for oneself in order to sync or resync the case figure at hand, and to even sometimes criticize the theory that we've internalized, because all of this also comes back to you've learned stuff, yes, but that stuff is not perfect. Those theories have always a core that is not necessarily good or right, or that is going to be perfect. And it's very important as a clinician to cut free of it. And a canned interpretation can help you cut free from it, at least for a moment, for you to really, truly be with the patient. But as I said earlier, you have to be open to it, because if you're not open to it, you can't use canned interpretations. The canned interpretations become forced interpretations, and you become self-convinced that you have the right way of seeing things, and the patient is wrong about his own subjectivity, which that in of itself is always a red flag. The patient isn't wrong about their subjectivity. They might not be aware of certain things, but they're not wrong when they experience stuff. And I think that that's something very important to restate, as some people, unfortunately, can become so embedded within their theories that they forget that they have another human in front of them, another human that can teach them both on the theory, because theories are always imperfect and incomplete, and on themselves. And canned interpretations, when we realize what they are as canned, as not right, as not perfect, opens up the possibility of so much more, and of a real therapeutic rapport towards the patient, and making the therapist and patient real people within a setting that is very professional but still very real, as both people become human on the same level, and they become, in a way, colleagues working together to solve a problem, an issue, be it a short-term issue or a long-term issue. So that's why I love canned interpretations as an idea. Of course, subjectively, when you realize it's canned, you might feel uneasy with that, but it's okay, because you're not lying to the patient when you were saying that. It was like a draft, in a way. A draft that leads to something better, something more complete, and something that can really, truly help. So it's not a waste of time, it's not a mistake. And that's something that I think is very important to also elaborate on. Because in therapy, except if you're going to hurt someone, except if you're brutal, except if you're manipulative, you don't fundamentally necessarily make mistakes. Or if you make mistakes, they're not something that cannot be resolved. In a way, mistakes can also help the relationship grow. And what I'm trying to say is that mistakes are okay, but abuse, that's never okay in any circumstance. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting. Before I leave this subject, I just want to tell you that Ogden never defined it really narrowly. It was more like something he said in a couple of times in the book, but it really had an impact in me, and I've been thinking of it ever since. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because I think it's very important as a topic, and that we can discuss it, and it necessitates to be discussed. Because I think that that's something that's fundamentally important, because you're not always going to have it right, or sometimes that ill-at-easeness within the interpretations can help further the therapeutic relationship, as I've tried to demonstrate throughout this video. So anyway, I hope you liked this video, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.